Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation presented by White House Custom Color.
Are you trying to mute me?
No, it's just real loud, and I can't.
I sold Amazon when it was $25.
Listening to listen, not listening to respond.
Yes. Oh, thank you for that. Marc Silber, thank you for joining me today.
Jed, my pleasure.
I'm excited to talk to you about a few things in particular, but let's start off by you telling me and the audience kind of who you are. Give me a little background on Marc Silber.
Marc Silber has been a photographer since age 12. I marked that as obviously I was shooting like most people, little snapshots and that sort of thing. But at age 12 is when I went into a darkroom for the first time and I learned the magic of developing film, which was cool, but it was making the prints that really whoa, all of a sudden I had control. Yeah. And up to that point, I take my rolls of film to the drugstore and they come back and they were little tiny things and they were very muddy and very discouraging. You didn't feel like you got your vision out there at all. But when I learned the darkroom skills, that's when it all lit up as a photographer. So since that time, I've been photographing. That was a number of decades ago. I'm not even going to say how many, but a lot, a lot of decades. And then, I ended up teaching photography. I got my start as a teacher early on. I was actually teaching mountaineering. So I've spent most of my adult life teaching people things, and obviously photography is near and dear to me. So I created a series of interviews that I've done called Advancing Your Photography on my YouTube channel, where I've interviewed lots of really great photographers over the years.
You have.
And then in 2016, I decided, well, I need to write a book. And so I wrote this book, Advancing Your Photography, based on my own experience, but also the people I'd interviewed, and put it together as a kind of a complete manual of photography. And that's basically what I do is I help people get better with their photographs.
Now I'm curious about something, because you mentioned for yourself personally, the magic occurred. Yeah. Initially when you were 12, right? Yeah. And you even went from the proofs that you could touch and feel and hold to a much larger, like 8x10 even, or whatever, that you were actually developing, right? Yeah. And that was a big, even for yourself, that was a big jump. Now, that all but doesn't exist these days, relatively. I know there are people that are shooting film. I know there are people that are developing their own film. But what I'm talking about is, in a relative sense, that rarely, if ever, occurs for the vast majority of the population. And so what I hear is that magic is not present for most people. Is that fair to say? Well, in that darkroom magic. However, I will say, the magic still exists. It exists because you process your images. But even more important, and I think this is relevant to our discussion, my mantra is make prints. Because, digital is great, but it's always going to be you looking at pixels on a screen, which is not the same as looking at a print on the wall. It's not the same. So let me ask you this then, with that real quickly, is the magic is still there. It's different. It's different because you're not seeing it show up, right? In a tray. Yeah. Right. You're seeing it show up on the screen. There's a lot more immediacy. Of course, you see 1,000 images basically at the same time. Yeah. So there is magic in that, but there is something about the print in your mind. Yes? Yes, there is. I mean, here's the thing. For those who have never worked in a darkroom, what's happening is you take this piece of white paper, you expose it, nothing has happened, you can't see anything yet. Then you put it in your developing tray and you shake the tray back and forth, and it does exactly what it says, it develops. And that's the magical thing. It's like, whoa, that image comes up and you get to see for the first time what your print looks like. For the first time. First time ever, you might have seen it through the negative and you might have made a little contact print or something. Right.
But, let's say you're doing an 8x10 or even a bigger, 11x14 or 16x20. That can get really fun. And there's this process. Now, it's not always perfect the first time either, but it's still pretty cool. You're still like thrilled. It's the chemical process that brings that about, which is different than digital. And we also get spoiled because we can look at can look at the back of our camera and see what's going on instantly.
So that's kind of what I was wondering about, because I hear a lot of people, because we started in the film days too, right? My wife's the photographer. She started in the film days. She had a dark room in her basement. Her dad built it for her. This is in high school when we started dating, right? So it's been a while. Let me put it that way. Okay. My point is this: like, I hear a lot of people from our day, back pre-digital, right? That will almost act as though there is a superiority piece there. And in some way it's, you could call it superior, but it's really different, because everything that you're describing, there is a magic there that has been lost to some degree. What I'm wondering though is for yourself, from a teaching standpoint, even, how has your maybe perspective or even style or even outlook in teaching changed or evolved as all of that has evolved? Because it's just plain different now than it used to be, right?
It is. Boy, that's a really good question. I hadn't even thought about it. Yeah, because in a teaching environment, for instance, you would, like, we're shooting with film, we're going out and shooting, maybe this afternoon we'll go into the darkroom and develop it, but there's a big gap between those.
There's a gap.
Right? It's not like, hey, let me turn the camera around, you can see what I shot right now, or I can just pull this card out and stick it in. Here's the thing, that one of the things I teach people, and I put this in my book, is I teach skills that really transcend whether it's film or digital. I mean, that's what I tend to concentrate on, like compositional tools, like visualizing your photograph before you press the shutter, things like that. Obviously, when it goes into the camera itself, now we're into a different realm here.
Right.
But one thing that, whether it's film or digital, you have to know how your camera sees, because your camera will see differently than your eyes.
I like that.
For sure. Yeah. That's super important. I mean, for one thing, we're looking through a little window, we're looking at either a rectangle or a square, and with our eyes, huge field of vision. Yes. So you have to know that. And also every camera is going to see things a little differently. In the film days, it was even more so, because every roll of film was slightly different. Every batch of chemicals, your developer, slightly different. You never quite got exactly this. So there's always that element of difference, which I think is also part of the magic as well.
Yeah. It's kind of the mystery piece, right?
The mystery of it. Yeah.
So you've talked to a lot of people, a lot of photographers over the years. That part's really cool, to go to your YouTube channel and even like see all these people. And then, even scroll through your Instagram feed, and then to have, you have an endorsement from Chase Jarvis, kind of one of the modern big boys of education in the last decade or so with Creative Live. What are some of the key things you discovered during the interviews? All the interviews, like, what are the things that stand out, really pop to you?
Well, Chase was one of the first guys I interviewed. Actually, it's interesting. The very first shoot that I did was Annie Leibovitz, believe it or not. We went to the San Francisco Art Institute together. And I was just starting out on this thing, and I saw that she was going to be in San Francisco walking through her exhibit, and I got an okay to go there and film.
Wow.
And she and I hit it off. It's like, Mark, old home week, So that was number one. The number two video was Michael Adams, that's Ansel Adams' son, that we shot in Yosemite, and then we went to his dark room in Carmel. And when I was putting the show together, I didn't want it to look like, okay, pigeonhole it. So I said, I need a really modern photographer. And so I asked Chase, who didn't know me from anybody.
Yeah.
Hey, Chase, I want to interview you? And he said, yes, graciously. I went up to his studio in, actually, a little known fact. I first shot an interview with him. This is how green I was as a video guy, because I was a still photographer. I didn't know anything about shooting video. And I left it to my cameraman. And the cameraman, we shot this in San Francisco in Golden Gate Park.
Yeah.
He put it on autofocus, and it focused on the background. And here's Mark and Chase out of focus.
Oh, no.
It was like devastating. I'm like, oh my God, I just blew it completely.
The whole video was like that?
Whole video. Useless. Oh. And so Chase said, okay, he was such a gracious guy. He said, okay, just come up to Seattle. We'll reshoot it. And we did. I went up to his studio, and he said some things in that interview that I still hang on to. One of them is, this is really good advice. He said, when you go out and you're going to shoot something, and he was giving an example of his advertising photographs, don't go out and immediately press the camera to your face. Look around without the camera. Walk the scene. Get to know what things are, where things are. Where's the lighting? What are you seeing? Do not even get your camera out yet. Very smart advice. And because if you immediately go in and you do this, you're cutting your field of vision down, and you're forgetting that the most important aspect is your vision, not what the camera sees. So that's
it goes back to what you were saying earlier, even, right?
Exactly.
To start with this rather than start
with too many people get fixated on cameras as their first point. And a camera is a tool that you have to use creatively, but it shouldn't guide you. You should guide the camera. You should tell the camera what to do.
So you started with Annie and Michael and Chase?
Those are my top two.
That's where you started?
Boom, boom, boom. Yeah.
I did set the bar pretty high.
I know. What I did was I took a piece of paper and I thought, okay, I'm going to do this show. Who are the top photographers? Because I want to start at the top and then attract other people.
Right.
And I wrote down a list. I wrote down Annie Leibovitz, Ansel Adams, Chase Jarvis, and what are the chances of being able to do all three of them one after another? I really lucked out.
That's unreal.
I know. I lucked out. And that opened the door.
What else stands out to you? Yeah, like it opens the door to all these other people. Then what out of all of that stands out? There has to be so many. I'm just asking.
Oh, yeah, there's so many. Well, a great one is Bob Holmes, who I've interviewed a number of times. He's a National Geographic photographer. He's won Travel Photographer of the Year award like 5 times, crazy number of awards. He's been published in 50 books. And he has so many things that I could tell you, but that point about you have to know what the camera sees. His famous quote is, don't let the camera get in the way of your photography.
Oh, yeah.
Because too many people do that. They do this. Yeah. We call it chimping.
Yeah, constantly, yeah.
And, every time you do this, you're missing a shot.
Yeah.
And if you're doing it with somebody else over there, it's like rude. You're going, hey, Jed, hang on a sec. Yeah. I don't really like that. And they're sitting there going, what does he see that I didn't?
It's really breaking up the flow of, especially during a portrait session or something like that.
Oh, man. Don't do that. Yeah.
No.
That reminds me of another, you're asking me some of the key things. So Matthew Jordan Smith, another amazing celebrity photographer, we talked about that. And he said, don't do that. You're allowed to look at the camera once, to just make sure your settings are good. But after that, that's it. You want the person. You get one. You want the person to forget about the camera. So if you keep doing this, you're reminding them.
Constantly reminding them of the camera. Right.
Yeah. I've got this thing between you and me, and I'm letting it interfere. So don't ever do that. The other thing that he said that I really love is you don't want people just looking good. You want them to feel good. Because if they're feeling good, that's going to come across in the photo.
It really does too.
It does. It's that
Sometimes that sounds cliche. I get it that sometimes it sounds cliche, but it could not be more true. Like we hear you really captured my son. You really that's really him. And I'm convinced that it's that feeling piece that's also being conveyed in the image. Yeah,
totally. Well, if you think about it, where are you going to look better if you are under slight bit of tension and you're trying to look good,
You're trying, yep.
You're trying to look good and have a good smile. And, I've done some modeling too. I don't know how I got involved in this, and it's really hard if you start having attention. You're not feeling it. It really comes across weird. This is my smile,
Just really fake.
It's really fake. But if you're just relaxed and one of the things he does is you got to have music on your set. Mm-hmm. Let people groove, let the music. He plays Aretha Franklin. He says everybody grooves with Aretha, it's like,
he loves Aretha. I know that.
Yeah. And he's such a wonderful, warm person.
Well, that also helps. Like another piece of advice could be like Matthew Jordan Smith.
Be cool.
You know what I mean? Like,
be cool.
Just be like him.
Oh man, I would love to be like him all the time. He is very chill and very warm and gracious, and that I guess is another thing, Jed. Here's Bambi Cantrell, another early person I interviewed.
Wow.
That's her whole thing is just the rapport with her subject.
Yeah, making that connection.
Totally.
Relational piece.
And she's funny as hell. You do not get to hear what she's saying, but she's saying some risque things or whatever whatever comes out of her mouth, she doesn't care. She's just trying to get you to relax and forget about the camera. And boom. It's pretty cool.
Now, what about misconceptions, though? That's a piece that you really specialize in that I'm really intrigued by. Is like, what are misconceptions that you have? Well, what are misconceptions that you have discovered are misconceptions?
Well, here's one that's really, I think, an insidious misconception. Photography is easy. It's really easy, and that sounds like, why would that be a misconception? Because expectations, like if you were to pick up a musical instrument, a guitar, a piano, violin, whatever, would you expect somebody to first day to play the violin and have it sound anything and like remotely like you wanted to listen to it? Absolutely not. But there's this misconception because these things are so readily available.
Yeah.
And so apparently easy to press the shutter and get an image. That you're all of a sudden a photographer. Well, that can lead to kind of a misestimation of what it takes to become a really good photographer.
Yeah.
Like in the old days of the darkroom and whatnot, the barrier to entry was pretty high. I mean, you really had to.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get into. Yeah.
Yeah, you were like, the difference between being a snapshot photographer and somebody who created a decent photograph, that was a pretty high bar.
Yeah.
And you could go around and press the shutter and take your film to the local lab, but it looked terrible, right?
And so hope that you might get something. Maybe
you probably didn't. And
probably didn't.
Probably didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have any photographs from that era that look good at all. But you knew, wow, to learn the darkroom skills, man, learning chemistry and this and exposure. And you knew that it was you're entering something like learning how to play the guitar.
Yeah.
And so the reason why I think that was, it's been brought up by a couple of different photographers I've interviewed. Dan Milner mentioned that. I think Bob Holmes mentioned that too, because it's misleading in terms of how much work you got to put into this thing to get good.
Yeah.
And it's better to have the correct estimation than to have some false idea of, well, how easy it really is.
I think that's true. And yet, see, here's the other piece. The other side of that coin for me is that the barrier has dropped so low now. both with the technology of the camera and the concept of digital in general, where you just can see everything right away. You're not really thinking about a limit, because it used to be, oh, that's $1, that's $1, that's $1, that's $1. You know what I mean? And now it's just like, well, I can just throw it on burst. I mean, I know people that are shooting 4K video and just scrubbing for a frame, Mark.
Oh, that pains me. That pains me.
I know it. And I'm not lobbying for one way or the other, but I'm just saying the technology exists now, whereas before it would have been hard for us to even think about that as being a thing.
It couldn't.
You know what I mean?
Couldn't do that. Yeah.
That's very intriguing. Give me another big misconception.
Okay, here's a good one. This may be met with controversy, but I have talked to a lot of pros, and they're all pretty much in agreement.
We're all about controversial stuff, Mark.
All right, good. You got to shoot in manual mode to be a real photographer.
Oh,
this has been bouncing around on the internet, and it's such a crock of you know what, because why? Every pro I know doesn't subscribe to that. You know why? Because it slows you down. Why do you need to prove yourself? Because look, obviously with these cameras we shot in manual, there wasn't any other choice. Well, now we've got a tool that it can elevate that. Right. Every pro I know either shoots, and I've talked about this with Scott Kelby, either shoots aperture priority most of the time, or shutter priority, occasionally manual because you have to, right? Occasionally.
Right. In some scenarios, right?
There's some scenario. I use my exposure compensation. I look at my histogram. That's how I'm making sure I'm not blowing out the highlights. But why this sort of holy grail idea? There's, I see these YouTube videos dedicated to teaching people how to shoot on manual. Why? What's the big deal?
I don't think it's a bad idea to know and be aware of it, right? Because like you said, every so often it behooves you to be able to make some of those adjustments. But I think it's a colossal mistake. And my hope is actually that this argument is starting to lose weight over time more and more. Kind of like the whole, there used to be there's the Mac PC argument, Macs are so far superior, or, the Canon, Fuji, Nikon, Sony. Come on. I mean,
come on. You can shoot. I've shot with every one of those cameras, and they're all going to give you good photographs. They have different features. So, okay. Pick the one you like. I just like
to think that over time, I hear what you're saying, and that is it's a gigantic misconception. But I think anyone that makes that general statement, I hear people say these things, and I'm just like, you're saying a lot more about yourself than you really are about your argument, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, because again, remember that little mantra from Bob Holmes: "Don't let the camera get in the way of your photography." And it's like going into a kitchen, and there's all these different, things that you can cook with. And the chef isn't really talking about what they're cooking. They're just obsessing over the pans and, I have this oven or whatever. And look, a great chef could cook over a Coleman stove.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. I've seen this before. I've seen this and heard this argument before, that you don't go to a nice restaurant and have a delicious meal and think to yourself, boy, that chef must have a fantastic stove or a fantastic, it doesn't even enter your mind. And it really shouldn't for a photographer either. And when it does, I would just say, maybe this is what you're saying, is that you're thinking about the wrong thing, or you're looking at it from the wrong frame.
Yeah.
No pun intended.
No, and the other part, I guess the big misconception here is to get, gear obsession syndrome, where you're just obsessing over gear all the time. Mm-hmm. Again, the pros I know, when I have discussions, the amount of time we actually talk about the gear part is pretty minor. I mean, we talk about, but it's like this much. Yeah. And most of the discussion is about the art of photography.
Yes.
Or how to relate to people, or like compositional tools or lighting, things that are more tangible than, okay, yeah, your gear, you gotta know your gear, but don't get obsessed with it.
Well, they're tangible, and that's absolutely true, and they're also timeless. Like to me,
yeah,
the relational piece and not letting your camera, or I'll even broaden it, your gear, getting in the way between you and your photography. That relational piece is going to hold true no matter what happens technologically over the next decade or century. Like no matter what happens, that piece is always going to be so paramount.
That's right.
To anything else, especially for like portrait photographers, and then composition for landscape photographers and portrait photographers. But like to like include everybody in this, those concepts and those things are always going to be important no matter what happens with the gear over time, because it's always going to get better.
That's right. And then kind of combining that with how complicated it needs to be, like you need, if you're going to shoot portraiture, you need lots of lights and then blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Hey, look, Vermeer. I love using Vermeer as my example of simple lighting. Oh, yeah. One window, north-facing window. Yes. That's what he had in his studio. It's beautiful lighting. It always works. That's what I've got right here. This is one window coming in. Yes. I do have an LED over here, but less is more. You don't. Peter Hurley, Peter, right?
I do.
Great, wonderful guy, great portrait photographer. And I had him on my show, and he talked about how he started. He had no money whatsoever, nothing.
Yeah.
So he used window light. He couldn't afford fancy lights. He used window light, and he went to Lowe's and bought, some sheets of white board to bounce. And that was his lighting kit.
I'm tremendously grateful, like eternally grateful to a fantastic mentor of my wife's who has passed. Darton Drake taught my wife one of her first classes ever. And he said, you can do this with one light. Create a wall of light with a softbox, and you can do this. And that's what he taught her to do at her first workshop. And she came home and she's like, I just need one light. We just need to buy one light. And so we did. Bought a big 5x7 softbox, and that's what she used for the first several years of her business. And it gave her a style and a look that everyone fell in love with. And I thought to myself, because she'll say this, she's like, if I would have gone to him, I was at the point in my career with my mindset. If I would have went to Darton and he would have said, you need to drop 50 grand on this setup, she's like, I would have tried to do that.
I know. That's what happens when you have a mentor. No, it's true.
It was like, we spent like $500 and had everything we need. I saw him later on in our career, but before he passed, and I said, Darton, I owe you lots and lots of money because you saved me so much.
That's good. But there you are. You have something simple that everybody can do in their own home, their apartment, or whatever.
I like that. I like the less is more.
Yeah, find one window. Work with that. And then, if you do need to add more lights, good. You've already learned how to do it with a single light. And that is also, by the way, very good advice for just setting up your lighting. Just first start with one. Because how do you know what you need until you start with that one? You go, well, I do need a backlight here. Okay, good. So fine. Then you add that. And,
and it's less about, I think it's less about right or wrong. Don't get me wrong. There are right ways and wrong ways to do all this stuff, right? Yeah. There really are. But I think it's less about that and more about as you're progressing, and this is going to lead into where I want to go next. Yeah. You're like developing your style and developing your look over time. Totally. Because you might be able to nail it with one light, and you might think, but that's not really the look I'm going for. I want to shoot more like this, or I feel more drawn to this, right? And I think I'm interested in your thoughts on what do you what's your recommendation? What are your recommendations or your advice for people that have been doing it for a while and that really want to take it to that next level, that next step?
I think it's basically creating projects is really, really important. So I have a class that I teach. I just got off of it. My book is called Advancing Your Photography, AYP for short. So I have a weekly class called AYP Plus. And so what we're doing now is I have everybody pick their own project. And then week by week, they come to the class and we critique them. Now, it's very different than a one-off photograph when you're working on a project because it causes you to think in terms of storytelling, for one thing.
Mm-hmm.
A single photograph could tell a story, and many do.
Yeah.
But when you start adding it in, here's like my story unfolding.
Right.
Also, I encourage them to don't just shoot under the perfect conditions. Go out. Like one of my students is photographing barns in the Midwest. Okay. First one, beautiful photograph. Gorgeous day with white puffy clouds, red barn, green grass. It's actually a really great photograph. I love it. But then that's not the only time you're going to be photographing. The next one she brought today was like heavy fog, really not great conditions.
Yeah.
But this tells the story, Yeah. And so when you get into storytelling rather than a one-off photograph, I really feel that elevates the person to the next level. That's probably one of the strongest things you can do. And
I like that look. I like that not just taking photos in perfect conditions.
Totally.
I mean, if you're an event photographer, you're going to run into lots of scenarios that are much less than perfect.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
You don't know how things are going to turn out most of the time. Even if you scout a location, there's all kinds of variables that'll pop up sometimes at the last minute, and you got to be ready to deal with that accordingly.
Same thing with travel photography. I mean, if you're sent to a location and you've got a couple hours to come back with that photograph, maybe it's in the middle of the day. How do you work with harsh sunlight?
Yep.
Well, there's ways to do that.
Yeah.
And you need to know that. So I love the golden hours as much as anybody else, but what about there's 24 hours in the day? What about all those other times? And
what about the other 23?
23 hours, and, especially when you're storytelling. I learned this. I had a really unusual experience as a teenager. I spent my last semester of high school in Mexico working on essentially a Peace Corps project.
Oh, wow.
And I took this camera that was given to me by my uncle. It's a Rolleiflex with dozens of rolls of film, black and white film. And I captured the people of this very small village, a very remote village, 2 days walk from a very small village, which was a day's Jeep ride from Mazatlan, Mexico. So way Sierra Madre.
Mazatlan.
Yeah, way up there, And I shot any time of the day. I shot at night. I shot in harsh sunlight. I shot early in the morning because I was really interested in telling the story. And those are some of my best photographs ever because I was engaged. It was more about the story than about, perfection of lighting, let's say.
Right. Well, because it was authentic.
It was authentic. Yeah.
If you see something that's always perfect, my first thought is, well, that's not real.
It's not real. Yeah. Look at Cartier-Bresson. He went out and photographed, and his famous remark is, because people sometimes, well, this image isn't sharp, it's out of focus.
Yeah.
He said, sharpness is bourgeois. It's like, it's about the story, not about
sharpness is overrated.
It's overrated. It's like if you're taking
sometimes it can be. So, to your point, like sometimes it's appropriate. Right? Because that's real.
Yeah, if you're taking an action shot and you're trying to like freeze the action, okay, you want a fast shutter speed and you want to stop, but sometimes it's better to let it blur, right? And get the motion.
It tells the story better.
Tells the story, and maybe you pan with it. That's even cooler because the background's all blurry, and but those are just tools that you can use to tell your story, and that's
I love it.
That's the fun of it.
Tell me this now. I know in your book you talk about getting inspired.
Yeah.
How
do you do that?
how do you, because it's getting inspired or being inspired, and I feel like so here's, and I'm just going to make this distinction for myself.
Sure.
There are times when I experience inspiration, but it had nothing to do with me trying to be inspired. I was just inspired by something. I think there's a difference between getting inspired and being inspired. I think being inspired can happen whatever. And maybe it's a matter of putting yourself in certain scenarios and being intentional, but getting inspired, that's what's different to me. Like putting it that way makes me think, all right, there's something, or maybe a list of things that I can do to find inspiration. Is that, am I putting that?
Absolutely.
Putting it out there,
one of the people that I interviewed was Joey Lawrence, amazing photographer.
I know Joey.
He started at 16, still photographer for the first Twilight film. How about that for your first gig?
Yeah. Yep.
And I asked him, "Hey Joey, what's your source of inspiration?" He said he looks at art, classical art, and goes to museums and looks at it and really studies it in terms of how did that artist use the frame? Where was the light coming from? How did they get this incredible moodiness into their, paintings, right? And so he used that as his source of inspiration. I've heard this from many photographers. Study art. Because remember, photography is kind of a latecomer. Let's say it was kind of hit the ground in 1837-ish, right?
Sure.
Decades, centuries before that, we have painting with those tools of composition and lighting already known to painters. And photography just adopted those same tools. But there's a disconnect. Unfortunately, many people don't connect the dots and go, wait a minute. If I want to become a better photographer, I should study the work of these masters. I can't tell you how many of these great photographers have told me that. And it serves two purposes.
Okay, keep going.
Well, two purposes. One is it is inspirational. It does fuel your, wow, that's pretty cool. I could try that. Right. And it gives you tools to use as well. You need both. You can't, just being inspired without tools is sort of like, hey, I'm inspired to cook, but I don't know necessarily how to do it. So where am I going to go with that?
Well, and I think that the point that I'm really gathering from what you're saying is it's one thing to be inspired. Again, like I was saying, there's times where I'm inspired. I didn't expect it. I wasn't looking for it, but I like the fact there's almost like a hope here, because I think there are times, especially on the last year or so, I've talked to people where they find themselves in a rut or they're just down, but I hear you talking about getting inspired, and it involves seeking it. You're actually looking for it. You're actively attempting to find inspiration.
That's right.
I think that's a big message.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to a student yesterday. Okay. And she was bringing this point up about not feeling inspired. And I just kept talking to her and I gave her some ideas. And then she finally came up with her own solution. She said, I need to just go out and make myself, I need to go to the place I'm shooting and look around enough until not just like that first piece of advice I told you from Chase Jarvis, don't have a camera to your face, look until something resonates. And then she goes, that'll work.
Yeah. Find it. Go out and find it.
I wrote a whole book about this subject called Create.
you have Create.
I wrote this book about creativity because it's such a big thing. And by survey, I found this was the biggest topic that people came up with was how can I be more creative? And what I did in this book was I wrote all my chapters, and then I did interviews with 12 different really super creative people. One of them being Chris Burkhardt, incredible photographer who I've interviewed before. And one of the things I wanted to debunk in there is that somehow you're born this way and everybody, they're creative and it's a perfect match and everything. No, he said it was a 10-year overnight process for him. Bam, 10-year overnight sensation. And the things he had to overcome.
Yeah.
These guys have personal things that they had to overcome.
Right.
And, that's the other thing. What gets in the way of your inspiration? Well, you're having a really lousy day, or you're going through, your parents are getting a divorce, or Nancy Cartwright, who's the voice of Bart Simpson, and many, many other voices. I interviewed her, and she told this story about moving from a small town in Iowa or Ohio to LA to become a voice actor. And she got this first thing, and her brother died of an overdose.
My gosh.
What a setback. What should she do? Should she immediately rush home and stop doing this, or should she honor him by carrying forward with her creative path, which is what she ended up doing? So these are the kinds of conversations I had in here. And I didn't want it to be all airy-fairy, hey, just sprinkle some fairy dust and you're going to feel creative. It's not like that at all. There's some tools that you can use to get there.
Well, would you say that one of the ways to be creative is to just start creating?
Yes, very definitely.
Just start.
Very definitely.
I want to be creative. I want to feel creative. Well,
stop talking about it. Do it. I know so many people. If I had $1 for everybody who I bumped into, I want to write a book someday. Someday I want to have an exhibit. Someday, you know what? Just do it. I don't care if it's like a book that you make yourself and you print it yourself and staple it together.
Right.
It's make a book. Good. Do it. Because from that little seedling, which by the way is what we all do before we print a book on fancy paper or whatever. You just print it on your own home printer, and that's your first draft. You should do that.
Version 1.
Version 1, But stop talking about it and doing it is really good advice.
I love that. That's a fantastic. I think it's a fantastic way to end. Stop talking about it and do it. Tell me now. Where can people find you? Just give your website or the best ways that people can find you and your materials.
Yeah. So my book, Advancing Your Photography, the best way to find that is to go to advancingyourphotography.com. How about that? That's the URL. And it's actually on special. I've got a big discount. You can get it for a lot less than you buy it anywhere else.
Yeah.
Good. So that's a good place to get my book. You can also click on another button and get my other books digitally if you want those too. So that's the best place.
And then you can go to @Marc Silber on Instagram.
Yeah, Marc Silber. You see it right there. That's a good
Marc with the
place.
C.
It's Marc with a C and it's Silber with
listening.
a B.
That's right.
You don't want to spell it MARK. And then silberstudios.com is my website. Yeah. You'll find everything there. And then on my YouTube channel, you can also just search for Marc Silber, MARCSILB. In fact, if you forget everything else and you do remember how to spell my name, if you Google that, you'll come up with everything else. We'll follow. That's handy.
That's perfect. Hey, I really appreciate your time, Marc. This was great today. Thanks for joining me.
I loved it. Thanks, Jed.
Hey guys, thanks for watching this conversation presented by White House Custom Color on YouTube. Be sure to check out our other content and click that subscribe button right there. Right there. It's there somewhere.